6 million. The number exists. It is verified. It is documented in German archives, in SS records, in the testimonies of more than 250 witnesses collected during 180 days of trial in Frankfurt, in notebooks buried beside the crematoria and unearthed after the war, in photographs taken by the perpetrators themselves. 6 million Jews murdered between 1941 and 1945. But that number by itself explains nothing, because behind that number lies a process, a sequence of decisions, a chain of command, a network of facilities, a railway system, a chemical industry, a meticulously designed protocol of deception, and millions of individual decisions made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. This documentary tells how it happened, exactly how it happened. The seed of hatred. Ideology before the murder. Before there was a single gas chamber, there was an idea. And that idea predated Hitler, predated the Nazi Party, and even predated the 20th century. It had its roots in centuries of Christian anti-Judaism, in 19th century theories about superior and inferior races, and in the social Darwinist pseudo-science that had begun to gain popularity in Europe from the 1860s onward. The historian Yehuda Bauer, director of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, put it bluntly. Nazi antisemitism was the heir to a Christian tradition of hostility toward Jews that stretched back to the very origins of Christianity. What was new was not the hatred. What was new was the technology and power of the modern state applied to that hatred. Hitler was an avid reader of the racist tradition that preceded Nazism. Oskar Peschel, editor of the academic journal Das Ausland and later professor of geography at the University of Leipzig, had introduced the term Lebensraum, living space, in 1874 to describe the geographical environment in which a specific nation originates and develops. The geographer Friedrich Ratzel adopted the concept in 1897 in his Politische Geographie and argued that territorial expansion was the central factor shaping the historical greatness of peoples. General Friedrich von Bernhardi transformed it into a racial imperative in his 1912 book Deutschland und der nächste Krieg, explicitly identifying Eastern Europe as the territory destined for German expansion. These ideas took concrete form in Chapter 14 of Hitler's Mein Kampf, titled Eastern Orientation or Eastern Policy. Hitler wrote that Germany's survival required Lebensraum, a territory vast enough to provide the Herrenvolk, the master race or master people, with economic self-sufficiency and military security. In 1927, he clearly expressed the consequence of this principle. The only way to solve the problem of German population pressure was to adjust the amount of land to the population, even through war. The communities that inhabited this land, he argued, had to be permanently eradicated through mass deportation, enslavement, or extermination. In October 1941, Hitler stated privately, "I intend to pursue this course of action with absolute determination. I feel like the executor of the will of history. What people think of me in the present is of no importance. I have never heard a German who has bread to eat express concern that the land where the grain was grown had to be conquered by the sword. But an idea, however extreme, requires a mechanism to become state policy." On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the Reich. What followed was a methodical escalation of legal exclusion, economic discrimination, increasingly brutal violence, and finally genocide. The process was not linear. There were internal debates within the Nazi regime over when and how to proceed. There were moments of apparent moderation that proved to be tactical pauses, but the general direction, viewed from the perspective of history, was always the same: more radical, more violent, more total. In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship, banned mixed marriages, and codified the racial hierarchy into state law. On the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, the Night of Broken Glass, also known as Kristallnacht or the Reich Pogrom Night, The SS, SA, and civilian groups destroyed 7,500 Jewish businesses, burned 1,400 synagogues, killed 91 people during the night itself, and sent more than 30,000 Jewish men to concentration camps in the following weeks. The violence had demonstrated that it could go unpunished. The world had protested verbally, but had not acted. The next phase began on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland. Polish Jews, more than 3 million people, the largest Jewish community in Europe, came under Nazi rule. What followed first required an intermediate step, one that prepared the psychological, logistical, and demographic ground for what was to come, the ghettos. The ghettos, hunger chambers before the gas chambers. In November 1939, the Nazi Party's Office of Racial Policy circulated a document entitled Guidelines for the Treatment of the Population of the Former Polish Territories Based on Racial Political Principles. The document's declared objective was clear: the ruthless elimination of all elements unsuitable for Germanization. To achieve this, the plan envisaged 3 tasks: deporting ethnic groups that could not be Germanized, Germanizing those considered suitable for it, and repopulating the region with German settlers. The Warsaw Ghetto was the first and the largest. In November 1940, the Nazi regime confined more than 400,000 Jews, according to some estimates as many as 460,000, within an area of 3.3 square kilometers in the heart of Warsaw, surrounded by a wall nearly 4 meters high. The population density exceeded 150,000 people per square kilometer. For comparison, Manhattan had approximately 28,000 inhabitants per square kilometer in 2024. The official food rations allocated to the Jews of the ghetto amounted to approximately 184 calories per day. The minimum caloric requirement for the survival of a sedentary adult is 1,200 calories. This was not a policy of scarcity. It was a calculated policy of starvation. Historian Lawrence Rees points out that more Jews lived in this small rectangle of Warsaw than in all of France. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who lived inside the ghetto and documented what he observed, wrote about children who died of hunger on the sidewalks, about entire families that disappeared within the space of a week, about the sound of bodies being collected on carts before dawn. The Łódź ghetto, in Poland's second-largest city, held 200,000 Jews under the control of Mordecai Chaim-Rumkowski, the Judenältester, the elder of the Jews, appointed by the Nazis to administer the community. Rumkowski made decisions that have been debated for decades. He collaborated in organizing deportations, decided who would be deported, and delivered speeches in which he asked parents to hand over their children. But any analysis of his actions must begin with one fact: the fundamental decisions were made by the Nazi regime, not by him. The choice presented to him was not one between salvation and collaboration. It was one between collaboration and his immediate murder, along with the murder of everyone whose fate depended on his decisions. The ghettos served several functions simultaneously for the Nazi regime. They concentrated the Jewish population geographically, thereby facilitating surveillance and control. They extracted forced labor from those interned. They served as temporary reservoirs of labor. And, although not all Nazi planners may have formulated this explicitly at the beginning, they were systematically killing their inhabitants without the need for gas chambers, through hunger, disease, cold, overcrowding, and the routine violence of the guards. The mortality rate in the Warsaw Ghetto reached approximately 5,500 people per month at the beginning of 1942. But the ghetto solution had one limitation from the Nazi perspective. It was too slow for the regime's objectives. The scale that Hitler had in mind required another mechanism: the Einsatzgruppen, the first method of mass extermination. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in the largest attack in military history. Behind the soldiers, following immediately behind the front lines, advanced 4 special units organized by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, the Einsatzgruppen. special action groups, a combined force of approximately 3,000 men made up of units from the security service and other police forces. In a document dated July 2, 1941, Heydrich explicitly ordered these units to execute all Jews serving the Communist Party or the Soviet state. But the actual order, transmitted orally rather than in writing, a deliberate pattern within the Nazi bureaucracy intended to preserve a degree of legal ambiguity, went much further. On June 24, 1941, 2 days after the invasion began, German forces entered Kaunas, Lithuania's second-largest city. Many Lithuanians, who had suffered under Soviet occupation since 1940, deportations to Siberia, nationalizations, and persecution, saw the Germans as liberators and directed their accumulated resentment against local Jews, who were collectively accused of having collaborated with the Soviets. On June 25th, in the courtyard of a garage in the center of the city, groups of armed Lithuanian civilians began murdering Jews one by one, striking them in the back of the head with iron bars. Pilot Wilhelm Gunzilius, from a German aerial reconnaissance unit, photographed the massacre. His images show the killers surrounded by civilians, including women and children, who applauded after each blow. Once all the Jews had been murdered, the man who had carried out the massacre climbed onto the piled-up corpses and played the Lithuanian national anthem on an accordion. Walter Stahlecker, commander of Einsatzgruppe A, which operated in the Baltic states, documented what had happened in a report. Local anti-Semitic elements were induced to participate in pogroms against the Jews. The impression had to be created that the local population had taken the initiative of its own accord, as a natural reaction to decades of Jewish oppression. The task of the security police was to set these purges in motion and guide them properly so that the liquidation objectives that had been established could be achieved in the shortest possible time. During the summer and autumn of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen and the police units accompanying them murdered tens of thousands of Jews every week. The pattern was always the same. The Jews of a particular locality were gathered through deception. They were told they were going to be resettled or registered, marched to the outskirts of the city, forced to dig pits or positioned beside natural ravines, and then shot in groups. The bodies fell into the pit. The next group was forced to lie on the corpses of those who had been killed before them. On August 15, 1941, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, traveled personally to Minsk to observe an execution. He saw how around 100 people, a mixture of partisans and Jews, according to Himmler's work diary, were forced to lie face down in a pit and shot from behind. The next group was forced to enter the same pit and position themselves on the bodies of those who had just been murdered. The Luftwaffe cameraman Walter Frenz, who had accompanied Himmler that day because he wanted to see something different for once, was quite shaken. The commander of the auxiliary police approached him afterward. "Lieutenant, I can't go on anymore. Can you get me out of here? I can't stand it anymore. It's terrible." Himmler, for his part, gathered the executioners around him once the massacre was over and delivered a short speech. He said that only he bore responsibility before God and the Führer for what had to happen. It was a necessary, though difficult, task. His men had to be tough and remain steadfast. But Himmler had seen something that day that concerned him from a strictly operational perspective, the psychological effect that shooting people at close range had on the executioners themselves. Some soldiers broke down, others drank excessively in order to be able to act. The efficiency of the method was limited not by a lack of willingness to kill, but by the limits of the perpetrator's own psychological endurance. The following month, Arthur Neber, commander of Einsatzgruppe B, began experimenting with alternative methods of mass murder with the assistance of Dr. Albert Widmann of the Technical Institute of the Criminal Police. First, they attempted to lock patients from a psychiatric hospital inside a bunker and blow it up. The result was described by Officer Wilhelm Jaschke as atrocious. Some of the wounded crawled out crying. There were body parts scattered across the ground and hanging from the trees. From the Nazi perspective, the experiment was a failure. The second test used carbon monoxide from the exhaust fumes of a truck engine at a psychiatric hospital in Mogilev, Belarus. The first attempt did not produce enough gas. With a larger engine, it worked. The same concept in modified form had already been used in the so-called T4 euthanasia program within the Reich. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen murdered people at a pace that would have astonished even their own organizers. The most significant massacre as a single operation took place at the ravine of Babin Yar on the outskirts of Kiev on September 29th and 30th, 1941. A combination of SS police battalions, Einsatzgruppen units, and local collaborators murdered 33,771 Jews by shooting over the course of 2 days. No single gas chamber ever killed a comparable number of victims within a period of 48 hours. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered between 500,000 and 700,000 Soviet Jews. By the end of the war, the total number of victims of mass shootings in the Soviet Union exceeded 1.5 million people. The method of mass shooting was effective in numerical terms, but it had logistical problems. It required large concentrations of armed personnel, left visible evidence across the landscape, was difficult to conceal from the civilian population, and, as Himmler had observed, generated psychological problems among the executioners themselves. The search for a more efficient method, more efficient in terms of the psychological well-being of the killers, not the victims, led to the development of fixed extermination facilities. Chelmno, the first extermination facility. On December 7, 1941, the same day as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the entry of the United States into the war, the first extermination facility built specifically to kill Jews began operating at Chelmno in the Polish Warthegau. 40 miles northwest of Łódź, in the Polish countryside, stood a deteriorating manor house opposite the church of a small village. Arthur Greiser, the Nazi governor of the Warthegau, had tasked Herbert Lang, commander of a unit that had already been murdering disabled Polish people in gas vans for 2 years, with finding a suitable place to kill the Jews of the Łódź ghetto who had been classified as unproductive. The mechanism was simpler, more portable, and more deceptive than anything that had been used before. Converted vans in which the engine exhaust was channeled into the sealed compartment where the victims were confined. SS man Kurt Möbius, a guard at Chelmno, described the process decades later with a clarity that remains deeply disturbing. The Jews were led into the basement of the manor house, where a sign read, "To the bath." From there they went up a ramp toward the open doors of the gas van. They had been promised that they would be disinfected before being sent to work in Germany. Generally, according to Möbius, they entered the vans quickly and obediently, trusting the promises that had been made to them. When they did not, Polish forced laborers whipped them inside. Zofia Sałek, an 11-year-old girl who lived in the village, heard what came from the vans as they passed. How terribly they screamed. It was impossible to bear. Once they brought children, and the children were screaming. My mother heard it. She said the children were calling, "Mommy, save me." Death took several minutes. The vans drove to a nearby forest, where Jewish forced laborers, compelled by the Germans to work, unearthed the bodies and threw them into mass graves. Estimates of the number of people murdered at Chelmno range from 150,000 to 300,000. The first victims arrived on December 7, 1941. On January 2, 1942, the first transport from Łódź contained not Jews, but Roma. More than 4,500 of them had been brought to the camp from Austria after surviving in appalling conditions inside the Łódź ghetto. By January 9th, they had all been murdered. The gas van method had its own problems. Capacity was limited. The process of unloading the corpses was slow and physically exhausting for the forced laborers, and the noise, the screams of the victims, could be heard by the civilians of the village. But as Chelmno began operating, another system was being designed at the other end of occupied Polish territory. one that would integrate the machinery of killing with the existing railway infrastructure in a way no previous method had contemplated, a system that would be built to kill millions, not tens of thousands. The Wannsee Conference and the Coordination of Extermination. On January 20th, 1942, in a villa situated on the shores of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 senior officials of the Nazi government and the SS met for approximately 90 minutes. The villa was elegant. Waiters were present. Drinks and food were served. The minutes of the meeting, written by Adolf Eichmann and preserved almost by accident in the archives, only a single copy survived the war because the Foreign Office had forgotten it in its files, describe, in meticulously euphemistic bureaucratic language, the plan for the systematic extermination of the 11 million European Jews identified in the participants' calculations. Of the 15 officials seated around that table, 8 held doctorates. Historian Lawrence Rees points to this figure with an observation that says everything. The level of education in the room did not act as a moral counterweight. On the contrary, the Wannsee Protocol was written with the linguistic precision of men who knew exactly what they were saying and had consciously chosen how to say it. The conference was chaired by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, acting under the authority of Hermann Göring. In July 1941, Göring had tasked him with preparing all necessary organizational, practical and material measures for a comprehensive solution to the Jewish question. Heydrich began the meeting by establishing the priorities. Under his authority, the operations of the final solution were to be coordinated with the ministries and agencies represented in the room. The protocol speaks of evacuation to the east and the final solution, with the same calmness with which an executive might speak of workforce restructuring. Only at one point does the mask slip slightly, when it describes what would happen to the Jews evacuated who survived forced labor. The remnant will have to be treated accordingly, since it is the result of natural selection and, if released, constitutes the germ of a new Jewish reconstruction. Historian Yehuda Bauer pointed out that Wannsee was not the moment when the decision to kill Europe's Jews was made. The decision, insofar as it was explicit, had emerged from an accumulative process of directives issued by Hitler and Himmler during the autumn of 1941. What Wannsee did was something different. It coordinated, institutionalized, and accelerated what had already begun. In Bauer's own words, it was nothing more than a forum for second-level officials who had to know what was happening in order to carry out their part. But this coordinating role had immediate practical consequences. 8 days after Wannsee, the first mass transport of foreign Jews, sent by an Allied country to the extermination camps, departed from Slovakia. The Slovak government, headed by the Catholic priest Josef Tiso, had reached an agreement with the Germans. It would pay 500 Reichsmarks for every deported Jew, in exchange for Germany's commitment that the Slovak Jews would never return, and that Germany would not claim the property they left behind. It was a contract in which one country paid another to murder its own citizens. Linda Breda, an 18-year-old young Slovak Jewish woman, was part of that first transport. She was told that she was going to Germany to work. Why would I have been afraid? We would work, then they would have money, and afterward they would come with us. At the station, she saw that cattle cars were waiting for them. "Where is the normal train?" she asked. When the train reached its destination, it was not Germany. It was Auschwitz. The Operation Reinhard extermination camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. While the Einsatzgruppen continued their operations in the east and Chelmno processed the Jews of the Łódź ghetto, something different was being constructed in the Lublin district of the General Government of Poland, static extermination facilities designed for one purpose alone, intended to kill all their occupants within a matter of hours. The first was Belzec. Located 75 miles southeast of Lublin, Belzec was designed under the direction of Christian Wirth, a veteran of the T4 euthanasia program, who had supervised the murder of Germans with disabilities in gas facilities located within the Reich itself. Wirth knew what worked and what did not. Belzec would be small, approximately a square 300 yards on each side, with the shorter flank running parallel to the adjacent railway line. The interior was divided into two zones: an arrival area with undressing barracks, warehouses for the property stolen from Jews, and accommodation for the guards, and an extermination area, separated by a fence and connected by a narrow passage known as the Tube, where the three buildings containing gas chambers disguised as showers were located, along with the area for burning and burying the bodies. The gas used at Belzec was not Zyklon B. It was carbon monoxide produced by a diesel engine located outside the false gas chamber buildings. The chambers had been constructed of wood with double walls filled with sand and lined internally with tin in an attempt to seal them hermetically. Lawrence Rees emphasizes a fundamental difference between Belzec and Auschwitz. Belzec was a place solely of death. No one arrived at Belzec to work. There was no selection on the platform. Prisoners were not registered. People arrived and died. That was why Belzec could be so small. It needed no space for anything that was not part of the killing process. The camp began operating in March 1942. The first 150 Jews who had been forced to build it were murdered in the new gas chambers as a test of the system before the first transport arrived. By mid-April 1942, approximately 45,000 Jews had been murdered there. Rudolf Raeder, sent to Belzec from the Lwów ghetto in August 1942, was the only survivor to write a personal account of the camp. He arrived in a freight car. No one said a word. We were aware that we were heading toward death, that nothing could save us. Apathetic, not a single groan. Upon disembarking, an SS man delivered a speech. Everyone wanted to listen, Raeder wrote. Suddenly there was hope within us. If they are speaking to us, perhaps we are going to live. Perhaps there will be some kind of work. The men were separated from the women and forced directly through the tube toward the gas chambers. The women's hair was cut first, and it was at that moment, while their heads were being shaved, that they understood they were going to die. There were lamentations and screams. Raeder was one of the few selected to work in the camp. His task was to exhume corpses and bury them in mass graves. We had to walk from one edge of the pit to the other to reach another pit. Our legs sank into the blood of our mothers. We were stepping on piles of corpses. That was the worst, the most horrible thing. Between 450,000 and 550,000 people died at Belzec. Of all those who were sent there, only 2 people survived to testify. Sobibor, built at the same time as Belzec farther north, followed the same model. The camp's gas chambers were expanded in the summer of 1942 to increase their capacity from 600 to 1,200 people simultaneously. An SS guard at Sobibor recalled overhearing a conversation among senior officers comparing the efficiency of the various extermination camps. The third camp, Treblinka, had opened after the others, and its commanders complained that they had come last in the competition. Treblinka opened on July 23, 1942, 4 days after Himmler ordered the complete emptying of the Jewish population of the General Government of Poland by December 31st of that year. Treblinka was located 60 miles northwest of Warsaw, alongside the main railway line to the capital. A railway spur ran directly into the camp. The commander of Treblinka was Dr. Irmfried Ebel, 31 years old, the only physician ever to command an extermination camp. Ebel had previously directed the Brandenburg Euthanasia Center, where he had begun his involvement in mass murder. In late July 1942, shortly after the first transports arrived from the Warsaw Ghetto, he wrote to his wife Ruth that his life was very hectic and that he was enjoying it. In another letter, he stated that even if the day had 100 hours, they would not be enough, and that he had managed to get his staff to go along with him, something of which he was proud and pleased. Ebel's ambition proved to be Treblinka's first serious problem. To maintain the fiction that the camp was a transit camp and not an extermination camp, It was essential that the bodies of the newly arrived be hidden quickly from those who arrived afterward. But Ebel accepted more transports than the system could process. By mid-August 1942, trains began to pile up at Treblinka station before they could be diverted onto the internal railway spur, because there was no time to clear the camp between one convoy and the next. Oskar Berger arrived at Treblinka on August 22nd. When he got off the train, he saw hundreds of corpses lying everywhere. Abraham Krzepitki arrived shortly afterward and found an enormous number of corpses lying next to one another. I estimate that there were 20,000 corpses there, whose mouths remained open as if they were searching for one last breath. That same night, another transport arrived. I ran toward the railway cars. I was shocked. All the cars were filled only with the dead, suffocated. They were lying on top of one another in layers, all the way to the ceiling of the freight car. When reports of this chaos reached their superiors, Odilo Globoknik, the senior SS and police leader in Lublin and coordinator of what would become known as Operation Reinhard, traveled to the camp with Christian Wirth, the newly appointed inspector of the extermination camps. Ebel was immediately dismissed. Franz Stangl, the former commandant of Sobibor, was appointed in his place. Under Stangl, Treblinka was reorganized and expanded. Operation Reinhard was named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich, who was assassinated on June 4, 1942, by Czech operatives sent by the British Special Operations Executive in an attack on his car in Prague. At his funeral, Himmler declared that they had the sacred duty to avenge his death, to carry on his work, and now more than ever to mercilessly annihilate the enemies of our people. That same evening, at a meeting of senior SS officers, Himmler declared, "Within a year, no one will be emigrating anymore, because now things have to be resolved once and for all." The three camps of Operation Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, murdered between 1.5 and 1.7 million Jews in total. The vast majority were Polish Jews. Between 850,000 and 900,000 people were murdered at Treblinka, the highest number of any camp except Auschwitz. In the first 10 days alone of the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto, which began on July 23, 1942, 65,000 people were sent to Treblinka. By the end of September, more than 300,000 Jews from the largest ghetto in Europe had been murdered. Adam Cherniakov, chairman of the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote in his diary on July 22nd, "We were told that all Jews, regardless of sex and age, with certain exceptions, would be deported to the east. By 4 p.m. today, a contingent of 6,000 people had to be prepared, and this was to be the minimum daily quota." The dilemma that tormented him most directly concerned the children in the orphanages. Did he have to hand them over as well? On July 23rd, Cherniakov swallowed a cyanide capsule. The deportations continued the following day under another chairman of the council appointed in his place. While the camps of Operation Reinhard were operating, the largest and most complex complex of the Nazi extermination system continued to grow 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow. Auschwitz, the origin of a camp that should never have existed. In the spring of 1940, 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow, beside the Sola River, there stood a complex of abandoned barracks on a plain where the fog took a long time to lift, and the winters lasted for months. 22 brick buildings, originally constructed by the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War and later occupied by the Polish army. Functional, unpretentious buildings surrounded by the urban area of Oświęcim, Auschwitz in German. The proposal to turn them into a concentration camp came from SS Hauptsturmführer Arpad Wiegand, an inspector of the Sicherheitspolizei, deputy to the higher SS and police leader and chief of police for Silesia. The argument was logistical. The prisons in the region were overcrowded with Polish political prisoners following the occupation. The Reich needed space. Richard Glucks, head of the concentration camps inspectorate, sent SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Eisfeld, the former commandant of Sachsenhausen, to inspect the site. Eisfeld determined that it was suitable. On April 27, 1940, Heinrich Himmler signed the official approval. The man appointed to build and command the camp was 38 years old and had been born in Baden-Baden on November 25, 1901. Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss. The son of a Catholic merchant who had dreamed that his son would become a priest, Höss had served a 10-year sentence for participating in an extrajudicial murder during the Weimar Republic. He was released under an amnesty in 1928, and in 1934 he joined the SS on the recommendation of Himmler himself. He served at Dachau under the command of Theodor Eicke, the founder of the Nazi concentration camp system, and later at Sachsenhausen. When he arrived at Auschwitz, he was a competent and cold administrator of institutionalized violence. Höss moved with his wife Hedwig and their 5 children into a 2-story house barely 100 meters from the camp perimeter. He lived there for years. The first 30 prisoners arrived on May 20, 1940, transferred from Sachsenhausen. They were German common criminals, the Grünen, the Greens, named after the green triangle sewn onto their uniforms, selected to establish the camp's internal hierarchy as kapos and supervisors. The first of them, Bruno Brodniewicz, was appointed Lager Ältester, camp elder. These men from the German criminal underworld established from the very first day a culture of systematic brutality directed particularly against Polish prisoners. On June 14, 1940, the first mass transport arrived. 728 Polish political prisoners from Tarnów, university professors, lawyers, doctors, Catholic priests, and some Jews. June 14th is the founding date recorded in the documents of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. By the end of 1940, the SS had confiscated the surrounding land to create a 40-square-kilometer exclusion zone, the Interessengebiet, that was constantly patrolled. In March 1941, the number of prisoners had reached 10,900. The identification system was meticulous. Upon arrival, prisoners had their hair shaved, were disinfected, assigned a serial number given the striped uniform, and had a colored triangle sewn onto their jacket beneath the number to indicate their category. Red for political prisoners, mostly Poles, green for common criminals, black for the asocial, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and pink for homosexuals. Jews wore a yellow Star of David formed by 2 overlapping triangles. Auschwitz was the only camp where prisoners were tattooed. The number was tattooed on the inner side of the left forearm. The ink was supplied by the Pelican Company. The system was developed from 1941 onward, when the mortality rate was so high that severely deteriorated bodies could no longer be identified by their uniforms. The number on the skin remained legible. The camp Höss built in 1940 was not yet an extermination camp. Prisoners died of hunger, disease, exhaustion, and beatings, but they were not yet dying as part of a planned policy of the state. That step would come in the summer of 1941. Zyklon B from pesticide to state policy. Zyklon B arrived at Auschwitz without murderous intent. It was an industrial pesticide developed from research into hydrocyanic acid, hydrogen cyanide, and manufactured in the form of small crystals that evaporated in enclosed spaces to eliminate insects. The distributing company was Degesch, a subsidiary of IG Farben. At Auschwitz, it was routinely used to disinfect uniforms and blankets in the disinfection chambers of Block 3. The bluish stains that the compound left on the brick walls were still visible decades after the war and were identified and documented by researchers at the museum. In the summer of 1941, August, according to the academic consensus, although there is no absolute certainty regarding the exact date, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch, the camp's deputy commandant, took the initiative to test Zyklon B on a group of Soviet prisoners of war detained in the basement of Block 11. August Kowalczyk, a Polish political prisoner in Auschwitz, observed the SS attempting to seal the area with sand and earth. The sealing was inadequate, or the amount of Zyklon B was insufficient. The following day, some prisoners were still alive. More cans of crystals were needed to complete the process. The second experiment was more methodical. It took place between September 3rd and 5th, 1941, and involved approximately 850 prisoners, primarily Soviet prisoners of war, together with a group of sick Polish prisoners selected from the camp hospital. The exact number varies depending on the source. Historian Franciszek Piper estimates it at around 850. This time, the prisoners were taken to the building of Crematorium 1 at Auschwitz. They were told that they were going to receive new clothing and that they had to undress. The doors were closed, the lights were turned off. Zyklon B was introduced from outside through openings in the roof. The process worked. Höss later described in his memoirs, written during his captivity and published in German in 1958 under the title Kommandant in Auschwitz, that he felt a certain relief upon discovering this method. He was troubled by the prospect of mass executions by shooting, which had been the practice of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. He had seen his soldiers break down morally when forced to shoot civilians at close range. Gas, he argued in his writings, distanced the perpetrators from the act itself. A witness to one of the first gassings in the crematorium climbed into the attic of the SS administrative building directly opposite the crematorium and moved a roof tile aside in order to observe. They were very kind to those people. Please take your clothes and pack your belongings. And those people undressed, and then they were made to go inside, and the doors closed behind them. Then an SS man climbed onto the flat roof of the building. He put on a gas mask, opened a hatch, poured the powder inside, and closed the hatch again. When he did this, despite the fact that the walls were thick, a tremendous scream could be heard. The SS started up 2 motorcycles to drown out the noise, but for 15 or 20 minutes the screams remained audible, gradually becoming weaker. Hans Stark, a member of the SS at Auschwitz, told investigators after the war that in October 1941 he had been ordered to pour Zyklon B into the opening because only one medical orderly had appeared. The Zyklon B was in granular form, so it dripped onto the people as it was poured in. Then they began to scream terribly because they now knew what was happening. After some time, the gas chamber was opened. The dead were lying in disarray everywhere. It was a terrible sight. What had begun as an experiment in the basement of a punishment block was becoming a mass extermination operation with its own logistics. For the first documented gassing of a Jewish transport in Crematorium 1 at Auschwitz I, on February 15, 1942, according to historian Danuta Czech, an established protocol was already in place. Deception was its fundamental pillar. The victims were told that they were going to take a shower and be deloused. They were asked to remember the number of the hook on which they had hung their clothes so that they could retrieve them afterward. Signs inside the facilities used the words "bade," bath, or "Desinfektionsraum," disinfection room. The vehicle transporting the Zyklon B bore the symbol of the Red Cross so as not to arouse suspicion. The fake shower heads installed in the ceiling of the chamber completed the illusion. The deception, it must be emphasized, was not an act of humanitarian consideration. It was a tool of operational control. As long as the victims believed they were going to take a shower, the logistical process was exponentially easier to manage. Birkenau, the camp built to kill. The decision to build Auschwitz II arose from the recognition that the original camp was insufficient for the purposes the regime had in mind. In September 1941, Himmler ordered the construction of a new camp capable of housing 100,000 prisoners in the village of Belzec, Birkenau in German, 3 kilometers from Auschwitz I. 7 villages were eliminated to create the necessary space. Their Polish inhabitants were expelled, their homes were demolished or appropriated. Birkenau means birch forest in German, a name that, in the years that followed, acquired a devastating irony. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, chief architect of the Bauleitung, the SS Construction Directorate at Auschwitz, supervised the design. His office employed both technically trained SS officers and prisoners with knowledge of architecture or engineering. His files survived the war because they were stored in a building separate from the camp's main archives, which the SS set fire to before liberation. In 2009, the German newspaper Bild acquired 29 of these documents, presented them to the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, at a ceremony in Berlin, and deposited them in the Yad Vashem archives. The plans include the complete layout of the Birkenau camp dated October 14, 1941, the design of the barracks dated October 8th, and the plans for crematoria 2 and 3 from November 1941, before the Wannsee Conference, before mass deportations officially began. The initial approved budget was 8.9 million Reichsmarks. It soon proved insufficient. The barracks at Birkenau were not the brick buildings of Auschwitz I. Many were wooden structures originally designed, in an irony the SS architects probably did not recognize, as stables for horses belonging to the German army. Each measured 35.4 by 11 meters, and was divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters each. Each compartment contained tiered wooden platforms, the bunks that prisoners used as beds, originally designed for 3 people and expanded to accommodate 4 when the pressure on capacity increased. The site was chosen on marshy ground. Alfred Czesław Przybylski, a Polish prisoner who worked on the construction, stated in testimonies preserved by the museum that this choice had been deliberate. I am firmly convinced that the choice of the site on wet ground was intended to exterminate the prisoners who worked there and also those who would inhabit the buildings. The first inhabitants of Birkenau during its construction were the 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war who arrived between October 7th and 25th, 1941. They lived in the mud, in unfinished buildings without heating and with minimal rations. By March 1st, 1942, only 945 remained registered. The others, more than 9,000 in less than 5 months, had died from cold, hunger, and disease. Birkenau reached its peak in May 1944, when 90,000 prisoners were simultaneously registered in more than 300 barracks. But that figure does not reflect the actual flow of people who passed through the camp. Most of those who arrived on the trains were never registered. They went directly from the train cars to the gas chambers. Its 4 crematoria, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with integrated gas chambers, were built between 1942 and 1943 by the company Topf und Söhne of Erfurt, whose technical personnel maintained meticulous correspondence with the SS in Auschwitz regarding air extraction systems, the resistance of bricks to the temperatures of the ovens, and the capacity of the elevators that carried the corpses from the underground undressing rooms to the furnace rooms. The total capacity of the 4 crematoria was 4,416 cremations in 24 hours. Birkenau was not adapted for extermination, it was designed for it. Life before death conditions in the camp. The day in Auschwitz began before dawn. At 4:30 in the morning in summer, and at 5:30 in winter, the only concession the system made to the Polish cold, a metal gong echoed through the blocks. The block supervisors began beating the prisoners with sticks to force them to get up. There was no room for slowness. The first official objective was personal hygiene. In practice, it was an impossible aspiration. Primo Levi described the washroom at Auschwitz III in 1944 as a place poorly lit, full of drafts, with a brick floor covered by a layer of mud. The walls were decorated with frescoes depicting the good prisoner, diligently soaping himself, and the bad prisoner, with a pronounced Semitic nose and dirty clothes. Beneath the first, "So bist du rein," this is how you are clean. Beneath the second, "So gehst du ein," this is how you end badly. Even the camp's propaganda was an instrument of humiliation. The latrines presented their own conditions of systematic horror. The gynecologist Gisela Perl, who survived the women's camp, wrote in 1948 that there was one latrine for between 30,000 and 32,000 women, accessible only at certain times of the day. We would line up to enter this tiny building, sinking up to our knees in human excrement. Since we were all suffering from dysentery, we could barely wait until our turn came. After washing came roll call. The prisoners went out into the courtyards and lined up in rows of 10. The appel could last anywhere from a few minutes to endless hours if the total number did not match. On July 6, 1940, roll call lasted 19 hours because Tadeusz Wierzchowski had escaped. Hundreds of prisoners remained standing throughout an entire night and most of the following day. In 1941, the system of collective retaliation was implemented. Whenever someone escaped, prisoners from the same barracks were randomly selected and sent to Block 11 to die of starvation. This practice turned every prisoner into an implicit guardian of the others. The working day normally lasted 11 hours. Much of the work took place outdoors: construction work, labor in quarries and gravel pits, and agricultural work. Breaks were not permitted. The Polish cold could drop below 20 degrees below zero. The thin fabric uniforms provided insufficient protection against the cold. No gloves, no extra socks. Viktor Frankl, a Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that sometimes it was so cold that prisoners urinated on themselves in order to warm themselves momentarily. A piece of cable found on the ground to tie together a shoe whose sole was coming apart could literally determine whether a prisoner survived the following week or not. Without protection for their feet, ulcers developed within days, and those ulcers could lead to infections that resulted in selection for the gas chamber. The food rations were calculated to keep prisoners functional just long enough to remain useful. Breakfast consisted of half a liter of coffee substitute, no solid food. Lunch consisted of 3/4 of a liter of watery soup. Dinner was the most substantial ration: 300 grams of bread, frequently moldy, along with a spoonful of cheese or 25 grams of margarine. Later, medical calculations established that this diet provided between 1,300 and 1,700 calories per day for men performing intense physical labor for 11 hours. The basic caloric requirement under those conditions was between 3,500 and 4,000 calories. The deficit was between 50 and 60%. Historian Peter Hayes describes how, in the IG Farben camp at Monowitz, prisoners were reduced to walking skeletons within 3 to 4 months. There was also an orchestra. A prisoner orchestra was forced to play cheerful music, marches and popular pieces, while the workers left the camp through the gates for their work shifts. The same music played when they returned. The reason was twofold: to facilitate movement in orderly columns and to simplify the guards' counting. The effect on the prisoners was one of particular cruelty. Alma Rosé, niece of composer Gustav Mahler and one of Europe's most brilliant violinists, led the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra until her death in the camp in 1944. The bunks at Auschwitz I were 3-tiered wooden structures located in rooms that housed up to 1,000 people during the worst periods of overcrowding. The Hungarian doctor Miklos Naisli, who worked under Mengelé's orders, described it. 800 to 1,000 people were crammed into the stacked compartments of each barracks. Selection on the platform, the split second that determined everything. The journey began with a lie. The deportees were told that they were going to be resettled in the East, that they were going to work, that their families would remain together. The deportees from Thessaloniki, where one of the oldest Jewish communities in the Mediterranean lived, with a history spanning more than 500 years, sometimes traveled for more than 10 days. From Hungary, the journey took between 1 and 3 days. From France, 2 or 3. In all cases, the journey was made in freight cars, without seats, without windows, or with tiny windows covered with wire, without toilets. 1 bucket for several hundred people. No guaranteed drinking water. In the worst cases, the overcrowding was so extreme that people could not sit down. They remained standing for hours or days, breathing the stale air of the sealed rail car. In summer, the heat could be deadly. Many died during the journey. The bodies remained in the rail car alongside the survivors until the doors were opened. The Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish ramp, was the unloading platform used from 1942 to May 1944, located between Auschwitz I and Birkenau, 2.5 kilometers from the gas chambers. The deportees had to walk that distance in columns supervised by armed guards with dogs. In May 1944, in order to handle the transports of Hungarian Jews, which at the height of their intensity reached as many as 12,000 people per day, the railway branch line that penetrated directly into the Birkenau perimeter was completed. The new ramp stood only a few meters from crematoria 2 and 3. The train entered through the arch of the watchtower and came to a stop. From that moment on, the journey to death was measured in meters. The selection was frequently presided over by Josef Mengele, who arrived at Auschwitz II on May 30th, 1943. Mengele personally supervised the arriving trains, especially from 1944 onward. According to testimonies collected by the Auschwitz Museum, he arrived elegantly uniformed, wearing white gloves and holding a riding crop in his hand. Sometimes music was arranged for the moment of arrival, popular or classical melodies broadcast through loudspeakers. On the platform, he announced, "Zwillinge heraus," twins, step forward. His particular interest in identical twins spared them from the immediate fate of the gas chamber, although it reserved them for his experiments. For everyone else, the selection criterion was codified. All children under the age of 14 or 15 were sent directly to the gas chamber. A stick placed at a certain height was used, and those who passed underneath it were selected to die. All women arriving with small children in their arms were sent to the gas chamber. So were all elderly people. So was anyone showing visible signs of illness or physical incapacity. Historian Raoul Hilberg wrote that virtually any defect could be sufficient grounds for being considered unfit for work. Those selected for labor, approximately 20 to 25% of the deportees on most transports, were registered as prisoners and assigned a serial number. Those selected for the gas chamber, 75 to 80%, were led toward the crematoria along a carefully designed route intended to maintain calm and prevent panic. The Auschwitz album, the series of photographs taken by the camp's identification service in May and June 1944 during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, constitutes the most complete visual record of this process. More than 200 photographs document the arrival of the trains, the formation of columns, and the selection process. The images show entire families, men wearing hats, women in coats, children holding hands, elderly people leaning on walking sticks. They also show SS doctors making selections with the simple gesture of a pointing hand. The photographs were taken by the SS themselves. They present the process from the perpetrator's perspective, orderly, controlled, and efficient. What they do not show are the terror, the chaos, and the cries of children being torn away from their mothers. The gas chambers, the engineering of extermination, the blueprints for crematoria 2 and 3 at Auschwitz-Birkenau were drawn with meticulous precision. Each consisted of 3 integrated components within a single complex: an undressing room, Auskleideraum, with numbered clothes hooks along the walls, an underground gas chamber measuring 30 by 7 meters, and a furnace room with an operating capacity of 1,440 bodies every 24 hours. Crematoria 4 and 5, of a different design, had their undressing rooms and gas chambers on the ground floor, each with a capacity of 768 bodies per day. The entire process to which the victims were subjected had been designed in every detail to keep them calm until the very last moment. They were led down stairways into the undressing rooms. SS personnel told them that after the shower they would receive hot coffee. Signs on the walls reminded them to remember the number of the hook where they had left their clothes. Fake shower heads installed in the ceiling completed the illusion. Once the gas chamber was full, it could hold up to 2,000 people. The airtight doors were sealed. SS men wearing gas masks approached the openings in the roof. They opened the cans of Zyklon B and poured the bluish crystals into the chamber below. Leib Langfuss, a member of the Sonderkommando, buried his diary, written in Yiddish, near Crematorium 3. It was discovered in 1952. In it, he described what he heard from the other side of the closed doors. Voices gradually growing weaker, anguished cries turning into sobs, and finally silence. The killing process took between 10 and 20 minutes. Höss testified before the Nuremberg prosecutors that it could take up to 20 minutes. According to Sonderkommando testimony, when the chamber was full, the bodies were piled in layers. At the bottom lay the weakest, the children, the elderly, and the women. At the top were the younger and stronger victims who had tried to climb toward the last pockets of unpoisoned air. When the doors were opened, the Sonderkommando began its work. They removed eyeglasses, dental prostheses, and orthopedic devices. The women's hair was cut off. By February 6, 1943, the Reich Ministry of Economics had already received 3,000 kilograms of hair from Auschwitz and Majdanek. It was cleaned in an ammonium chloride solution, dried, combed, and packed into paper sacks before being shipped to textile factories in Germany. When the Red Army liberated the camp in January 1945, it found 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags ready for shipment. The gold extracted from victims' teeth under Himmler's order of September 23, 1940, was sent to the SS Medical Service. By early 1944, between 10 and 12 kilograms of gold were being recovered each month. The ashes were buried, dumped into the Vistula River, or used as fertilizer on nearby agricultural fields. Bone fragments that had not burned completely were crushed in wooden mortars. During the period of peak activity, from May to July 1944, during the deportations of Hungarian Jews, the crematoria operated literally without interruption. According to calculations by historian Franciszek Piper and the Auschwitz Museum, of the approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews deported to Auschwitz between May 14 and early July 1944, about 320,000 were murdered in the gas chambers during that same period. 75% of the total in less than 2 months, a rate of extermination unprecedented in human history. During those days in July 1944, when 12,000 people arrived daily by train, the Sonderkommando was forced to resort to open-air cremation in pits dug behind Crematorium 5. The columns of smoke were visible for miles around. The corporation and death, IG Farben and Auschwitz 3, 7 kilometers east of Auschwitz 1. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben selected a site in 1941 to build a synthetic rubber factory. The choice was no accident. The Oststeuergesetz, Eastern Tax Law of December 1940, granted tax exemptions to corporations willing to develop industry in the eastern border regions. The Auschwitz concentration camp, only a few kilometers away, provided a virtually free source of labor. In February 1941, Himmler ordered the expulsion of the Jewish population of Oswiecim to make room for skilled German workers. By May of that year, several hundred prisoners were rising at 3 a.m. to march twice a day from Auschwitz 1 to the construction site. When SS administrators became concerned that a long column of exhausted prisoners marching through the town of Oswiecim might damage German-Polish relations, they ordered the prisoners to shave every day and to sing while marching. In October 1942, the complex was completed. IG Farben financed and built it. It was the first concentration camp funded and constructed by private industry. Auschwitz III, Monowitz measured 270 by 490 meters. IG Farben paid the SS between 3 and 4 Reichsmarks for each prisoner assigned to a 9 to 11-hour work shift. The company calculated and monetized human life as a factor of production. Between 1943 and 1944, approximately 35,000 prisoners worked at the plant. Of these, 23,000 died from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion, an average of 32 deaths per day. Camp administrators constantly threatened the prisoners with the gas chamber. An employee of Bayer, then part of IG Farben, wrote in a letter to Höss, preserved in the archives, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We therefore request that you send us another group of women in the same number and at the same price." Among the other German companies that established factories with their own satellite camps were Krupp and Siemens Schuckert. The ink used to tattoo identification numbers on prisoners' forearms was manufactured by Pelikan. On August 20, 1944, Allied aircraft bombed the IG Farben plant for the first time. They struck again on September 13th and on December 18th and 26th. The explosions destroyed parts of the facilities. The prisoners continued working amid the rubble. Mengele and Block 10, when science became torture. Block 10 of Auschwitz I was separated from Block 11 only by a corridor and the courtyard known as the Wall of Death. While Block 11 symbolized punishment, starvation cells, standing cells where 4 prisoners were forced to remain standing together in a space measuring just 90 by 90 centimeters throughout entire nights, and the post where prisoners were suspended by their arms twisted behind their backs. Block 10 represented something in a different way, even more disturbing: the systematic corruption of medical science in the service of Nazi ideology. There, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Klauberg injected chemical substances into women's uteruses in an attempt to block them permanently as part of a research program on mass sterilization. Horst Schumann exposed the genitals of men and women to X-rays in order to induce sterility through radiation damage. The most notorious of these physicians arrived at the camp on May 30, 1943. Josef Mengele, 32 years old, an SS Hauptsturmführer and holder of doctorates in both medicine and anthropology from the University of Frankfurt, was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was punctual, meticulous, and impeccably dressed. He personally supervised the arrival of deportation trains, at times listening to classical music broadcast over the camp loudspeakers while making selections with the motion of his hand. His particular obsession was identical twins. He also took an interest in people with dwarfism, individuals with physical deformities, and those carrying hereditary diseases. In Barracks 29 and 31 at Birkenau, he established a kindergarten of sorts for the children on whom he conducted experiments. They received better food rations than the other prisoners. According to the testimony of survivor and researcher Eva Moses Kor, during selections on the railway ramp he repeatedly called out, "Zwillinge heraus," twins, step forward, in the tone of someone handing out candy. The selected twins were measured in every conceivable way, photographed and subjected to dental, vision, and hearing examinations. Blood was drawn from them. They underwent surgical procedures and cross-transfusions. When one twin died, Mengele ordered the other to be killed so that he could perform simultaneous comparative autopsies. Another SS physician, SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Heismeyer, took 20 Polish Jewish children from Auschwitz to the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, where he infected them with tuberculosis bacteria in order to test possible treatments. In April 1945, when the Allied advance threatened to expose the experiment, the children were hanged to eliminate the evidence. Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, Secretary General of the Ahnenerbe, the SS's pseudo-scientific research institute, founded by Heinrich Himmler in 1935 to provide an academic veneer for Nazi ideology, delivered the skeletons of 87 Jewish prisoners selected for their physical characteristics to the Anatomical Institute of the Reich University of Strasbourg. The collection had been authorized by Himmler and directed by Professor August Hirt. Brandt and Sievers were executed in 1948 after being convicted in the doctors' trial. The doctors' trial at Nuremberg, held between 1946 and 1947, was the first of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials that followed the International Military Tribunal. Its judgments articulated for the first time in international law the principles that became known as the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics: the voluntary consent of the research subject, genuine scientific necessity, and the participants' right to withdraw from an experiment. Every one of those principles had been systematically violated in Block 10. Those who rebelled, resistance, escapes, and the Sonderkommando uprising. Auschwitz was designed to prevent resistance. It succeeded almost completely. Almost. The first documented escape occurred on July 6, 1940, barely 3 weeks after the arrival of the first mass transport. Tadeusz Wojciechowski, a Polish prisoner, escaped from the camp. The collective reprisals resulting from that escape lasted 19 hours, with hundreds of prisoners forced to stand in the courtyard under the sun and later in the darkness. According to historian Henryk Szwibocki, at least 802 prisoners attempted to escape during the entire existence of the camp, 757 men and 45 women. Of these, 144 succeeded. Among the most notable escapes was the one on June 20th, 1942, when 4 Polish prisoners, Eugeniusz Bendera, Kazimierz Pichowski, Stanisław Gustav Jasta and Józef Lempart, broke into a storage facility. 3 of them put on SS uniforms, seized rifles and a staff vehicle, and left the camp with the 4th prisoner disguised as a captive. Later they sent a letter to Höss apologizing for the loss of the vehicle. On July 21st, 1944, prisoner Jerzy Bielecki, dressed in an SS uniform and, using a forged pass, crossed the camp gate with his Jewish girlfriend Syla Kibulska, whom he presented as a prisoner who was supposed to be interrogated. Both survived the war. Yad Vashem recognized Bielecki as a righteous among the nations. On April 27, 1944, Rudolf Werber, prisoner number 44070, and Alfred Wetzler, prisoner number 29162, escaped to Slovakia, carrying detailed information about the gas chambers and crematoria of Birkenau. The report they prepared, known as the Werber-Wetzler Report, was the first document to describe with technical precision the operation of Auschwitz's extermination facilities. Its distribution in June 1944 contributed to the decision of Hungarian Regent Miklos Horthy to temporarily halt deportations from Hungary. The Werber-Wetzler Report, together with the testimonies of Arnošt Rosin and Czesław Mordowicz, who escaped on May 27, 1944, and that of Jerzy Tabot himself, formed what became known as the Auschwitz Protocols, published in full in November 1944 by the United States War Refugee Board. By that time, more than 2/3 of the 437,000 Hungarian Jews deported had already been murdered. Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army deliberately allowed himself to be arrested in Warsaw in September 1940 so that he could be deported to Auschwitz under prisoner number 4859, using the alias Tomasz Serafiński. From inside the camp, he organized the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Union of Military Organizations, and regularly sent reports to the outside world. His second report estimated that 1.5 million people had been murdered in Auschwitz. He escaped on April 27, 1943. The Polish government in exile distributed this information among the Allies. The responses were slow, insufficient, or simply never came. And then, on October 7, 1944, something happened that the architects of the camp had considered impossible. The Sonderkommando revolted. The trigger was the announcement that 300 members of the Sonderkommando would be transferred to clear rubble in a nearby village. The Sonderkommando members knew what such transfers meant. The group, composed mainly of Greek and Hungarian Jews, rose up. They attacked the SS with stones, hammers and tools. They killed 3 guards. They set Crematorium 4 on fire with oil-soaked rags. The prisoners from Crematorium 2, upon hearing the explosion, believed that the revolt had begun throughout the entire camp. They threw their German capo into one of the ovens. They cut the electrified wire fence with pliers and fled toward Reiskow, where they hid in the barn of an Auschwitz subcamp. The SS arrived, surrounded the barn, and set the building on fire. When the rebellion was crushed, 451 members of the Sonderkommando had been murdered. The remaining 212 survived for several more months. One of those who died during the revolt was Zalman Gradowski, who had buried his notebooks written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3. After the war, another surviving member of the Sonderkommando showed investigators where to dig. The notes were found. They were published decades later under the title From the Heart of Hell. Another member of the Sonderkommando, whose identity remains unknown, created the drawings of the so-called Auschwitz notebook using charcoal. 22 illustrations showing the process from the arrival of the train to the ovens. Near Crematorium 3, Salmen Lowenthal buried his notebooks, written in Yiddish. They were found in 1962. The map of horror, the extermination centers across Europe. The Nazi system of mass murder was not confined to Poland or to the major camps. Majdanek, on the outskirts of Lublin, functioned both as a concentration camp and as an extermination camp, with gas chambers that used both Zyklon B and carbon monoxide. It is estimated that between 60,000 and 80,000 people were murdered there, including at least 60,000 Jews. On November 3, 1943, the SS executed more than 18,000 Jews at Majdanek in a single day, the largest documented single massacre in one individual camp, in what was known as Operation Harvest Festival, Action Erntefest. The bodies were buried in enormous mass graves in the nearby Krempiec forest, while loudspeakers played jazz music and folk music to drown out the sound of the gunfire. But no victim count from any individual camp surpasses that of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where more than 1/6 of all Holocaust victims were concentrated. The deportation system that supplied these camps extended across all of occupied Europe. From Greece, where the Jews of Thessaloniki, around 46,000 people, were deported between March and August 1943 in journeys lasting more than 10 days. From the Netherlands, where more than 100,000 of the 140,000 Dutch Jews were deported, most of them to Sobibor and Auschwitz. From France, where the Vichy authorities actively collaborated with the German occupation authorities in the identification, roundup, and deportation of Jews, including stateless people and immigrants. From Italy, even after September 1943, when Germany directly occupied the northern part of the country. And in 1944, from Hungary, which until then had represented the greatest success of resistance against Holocaust deportations. Hungary had approximately 750,000 Jews in 1944, the last major Jewish community in Europe that remained relatively intact. Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest on March 19, 1944, the day the Wehrmacht occupied the country. In less than 2 months, between May 14 and July 7, 1944, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. They arrived on trains carrying 4 transports per day. 75% of the more than 320,000 people were gassed upon arrival. The halt of Hungarian deportations in July 1944, ordered by Regent Miklos Horthy under international and diplomatic pressure, came too late for the majority of victims. Nevertheless, it represented the only documented instance in which external pressure managed to temporarily stop large-scale deportations. The death marches and the liberation. On January 18, 1945, Engelbert Marketsch, a German criminal transferred from Mauthausen to Auschwitz, was assigned prisoner number 202499 in Auschwitz. He was the last. That day, as the Red Army advanced from the east, the SS ordered the evacuation of the camp. Approximately 58,000 prisoners were forced to march westward on foot in the middle of the Polish winter, with temperatures that could fall to 20 degrees below zero. Those who could no longer continue were murdered on the spot. Execution squads followed the column and killed those who fell behind. Historian Peter Longerich estimated that approximately 1/4 of the deportees died during these marches. On January 20th, crematoria 2 and 3 were blown up. On January 23rd, the warehouses known as Canada, named that way by the prisoners because Canada represented a country of unimaginable wealth, were set on fire. They burned for 5 days. Crematorium 5 was destroyed on January 26th, one day before the arrival of the Red Army. On January 27th, 1945, at 9 o'clock in the morning, soldiers of the 100th Rifle Division of the Red Army entered Auschwitz III, the IG Farben factory camp at Monowitz. Other units of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front reached Auschwitz I and II at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They found 7,000 prisoners alive. They found 600 bodies. They found 837,000 pieces of women's clothing, 370,000 men's suits, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and the 7,000 kilograms of human hair ready to be shipped. Soviet Colonel Georgy Elisavetsky, who entered one of the barracks, tried to speak with the survivors in Russian, Polish, German, and Ukrainian. No one answered. Finally, he spoke a few words in Yiddish. He said that he was Jewish. He said that they had come to liberate them. The survivors ran toward the soldiers, knelt down and kissed the lapels of their coats. Primo Levi, who was in the infirmary suffering from scarlet fever, described the first 4 soldiers on horseback who approached. They cast strangely ashamed looks at the bodies and at the few people who were still alive. It was that shame we knew so well, he later wrote. The feeling of guilt that such a crime could exist, that it had entered irrevocably into the world of existing things. The death marches did not end with the liberation of Auschwitz. They continued in other camps for weeks afterward. The Bergen-Belsen camp in northern Germany was liberated by British forces on April 15, 1945. They found approximately 60,000 survivors suffering from extreme starvation and a pile of more than 10,000 unburied corpses. Dachau, the oldest camp in the Nazi system, was liberated by American forces on April 29, 1945. The war in Europe ended 9 days later. The final numbers, what the archives say. The definitive figures of Holocaust victims have been debated, refined, and documented for decades. The most comprehensive study of the victims of Auschwitz was carried out by historian Franciszek Piper and published by Yad Vashem in 1991. His conclusions? Of the at least 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, at least 1.1 million were murdered. The breakdown: approximately 960,000 Jews, 865,000 of them gassed immediately upon arrival without ever being registered, 74,000 ethnic Poles, 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and between 10,000 and 15,000 citizens of other European nationalities. 1 out of every 6 Jews murdered in the Holocaust died at Auschwitz. For the Holocaust as a whole, historian Yehuda Bauer, among others, estimates that the number of murdered Jews was between 5.7 and 6 million. The most commonly cited figure is 6 million, although a margin of uncertainty is unavoidable. Many victims were never registered before their deaths, and the records that did exist were deliberately destroyed. The breakdown by national communities is devastating. Poland, approximately 3 million murdered Jews, half of all Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Hungary, more than 430,000, the highest number of victims of any country after Poland. Soviet Union, more than 1.5 million, mostly victims of the Einsatzgruppen. Netherlands, more than 100,000 of the 140,000 Dutch Jews. France, approximately 77,000, more than 1/3 of them not French citizens. Greece, more than 60,000, representing 86% of the Greek Jewish community. More than 1 million of those murdered were children. What memory preserves and what oblivion threatens. In 1947, the Polish government passed the law establishing the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum on the grounds of the main former camps. In 1979, UNESCO inscribed the site on the World Heritage List. On January 27, 2005, the 60th anniversary of the liberation, the United Nations General Assembly designated that date as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. In 2018, a survey commissioned by the Claims Conference found that 41% of the American adults surveyed did not know what Auschwitz was. 22% stated that they had never heard of the Holocaust. The survivors who were able to testify for decades, Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, Elie Wiesel, Edith Eger, Simone Weil, have died or are reaching the end of their lives. The generation of direct witnesses is disappearing. What remains are the documents, the buildings, the objects, the 44,000 pairs of shoes found at Auschwitz, the 7,000 kilograms of hair, and the work of historians who continue to investigate the archives. Wiesel said on the 50th anniversary of the liberation, "After Auschwitz, the human condition is no longer the same. After Auschwitz, nothing will ever be the same again." What this documentary has attempted to show is that the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust did not die by accident. They died through a process that began with an ideology, became state policy, materialized through bureaucratic and architectural structures, was carried out through hundreds of thousands of individual decisions made by people who, for the most part, knew exactly what they were doing, and was partially financed by private companies that calculated the value of slave labor as an accounting item. The documents exist, the blueprints exist, the correspondence exists, the testimonies exist. Auschwitz did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with an idea about who deserved to exist and who did not. It ended with ovens whose remains still stand today, 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow, in a place where the morning fog still takes a long time to lift and where winters last for months. And the number with which we began this documentary, 6 million, is not a statistical abstraction. It is the sum of 6 million individual decisions to kill, made by people who chose to participate, by people who chose to remain silent, and by people who chose to look away.